Okay, I think we should get started. People will still be coming in, but I'm Barry Goodison. I'm chair of the CMOS Ottawa Center, and I want to welcome everybody today for participating in our, quote, luncheon talk, which we've been doing now, these talks virtually, and been able to engage many people. I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. So not only have your video off, but we ask that you also turn off, well, video and audio to minimize background noise and maximize bandwidth. So if you can turn off your audio and video to make sure it's off, except for the speaker, of course. For questions, you can, we'll be using the chat function, which if you haven't seen it, it's on the bottom bar, says chat. And when you click on that, you can type in your question. You can type it in at any time during the talk, just as you remember it. And Len Berry will be the moderator for the question and answer period. And Len will present those questions in order that they're there, and he may have to combine a couple if we have duplicate questions, which does happen, or similar questions. So that's how we will be handling that. The moderator will present the question to the speaker. This session is being recorded, and it will be posted on the CMOS YouTube channel within a couple of days, I expect, as well. All of our other previous talks are on the CMOS YouTube channel if you're interested in going back. And so with that, I'd like to turn over to Dawn Conway to introduce our speaker today. Dawn?
Thank you, Barry. Well, as an Ottawa U geography grad, I'm just delighted to welcome Konrad Gajewski to talk to us today. Konrad is a professor and former chairman in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Ottawa. And he's also the founding director of the university's main Center for Climate Change Research, the Laboratory for Paleoclimatology and Climatology. Konrad received his doctorate in meteorology and statistics from the University of Wisconsin. At the University of Ottawa, he splits his time between his teaching and his research. And in fact, he got the 2014 Professor of the Year Award from the Faculty of Arts. He has research sites in the Arctic and has worked in the Yukon. And I believe has done a little bit of work in Gatineau Park on lakes there, but he can tell me if I'm wrong on that. But I am told that the basement of the geography building at the University of Ottawa houses a very healthy collection of sediment cores for his work on the environmental history of the Holocene. Konrad's research deals with climate and variability and change during the last 10,000 years, the Holocene, and its impacts on ecosystems and human populations. And that is the focus of his talk today. So we welcome you, and I turn it over to you, Konrad, to present your talk. We're looking forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you, Dawn. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So let me just start. As Dawn has mentioned, I'm going to be looking at one component of our research program at the LPC, the Laboratory for Paleoclimatology and Climatology. We're going to be looking at work that we've been doing in the Arctic for now 36, 37 years, when we finally, in the last few years, accumulated enough data so that we could start to get a picture of what was happening over the course of the Holocene across the North American Arctic. Here we'll include Greenland as part of this, and the impact on the vegetation, as well as on human population. So I'm going to go quickly through some background. Then I'm going to look at a project we had at looking at tree line in northern Quebec, sort of the southern boundary of the Arctic, Then we'll look at the climate history of the Arctic. And finally, we'll look at the impacts of this climate variability on the terrestrial ecosystems and human populations. We've also done a lot of work looking at the impact on freshwater ecosystems, but I don't have time to talk about that today. So first, just a little bit of background. Here we have the map showing the deglaciation, the extent of the ice sheet from about 16,000 years ago until the present. And we'll be looking at the last 10,000 years mostly in this talk. So by the time we had 10,000 years here, you can see there's still a large ice sheet over eastern and central Canada, as well as over some of the Arctic islands. And then around sometime between 8.2, 8.4 kiloyears. So sometimes I'll be talking about kiloyears, thousands of years, 8.2. The central part of the ice sheet collapses, so you had a little bit of residual ice left in Quebec and toward the west, and then by 7,000 years ago there was only a little bit of ice left. So during the early part of the period that we're talking about, we had this ice sheet, which of course is a major climate forcing, but also covered large extent of the land. Then the other important forcings we have to look at is the so-called Milankovitch, or the insolation forcing, the incoming solar radiation. And that's the top curve that you see here in yellow. And so we see that during the early Holocene, and here we're going to go from about 11.9 to 8.2 is the early Holocene, and from 8.2 to 4.2 kiloyears is the mid-Holocene, and the late Holocene is the last 4.2 kiloyears, last 4,200 years. So in the early Holocene, you had more incoming solar radiation in summer coming into the Arctic. And this is going to have an impact. And then if you look at the other four curves below it, you can look at the third from the bottom is the light blue. That just shows the ice extent, what I've just shown you. And then the other three curves are oxygen isotope, or temperature computed from the oxygen isotope, and the ice melt from the Agassiz and the Grip ice core. So these are very well-known series of paleoclimate series. If we go to the second line from the top, the red, this is just the temperature from the Agassiz ice core, and you can see the large increase in temperature at the beginning of the Holocene, at the end of the Younger Dryas, and then sort of this slow decline to the present. The melt, on the other hand, you can see there's a large increase in melt percentages in the early Holocene, which then decreased into the late Holocene. And this corresponds to this period of high insolation. And then during the Greenland ice core, the Grip, the bottom curve, you can see it has a similar result. So we see the Grip shows quite well that during the glacial period, you had these large variations in the delta O18, which is proportional to temperature in some way. But then during the Holocene, there's not that much variability. And so the question now is, what happens in the rest of the Arctic? And these are all from the top of ice sheets. So can we make some sense out of that? And I should say that the whole question, we're looking at various temporal resolution here. We're looking at the order of hundreds of years. In some cases, we'll be looking at up to decades. But we're looking at the Holocene changes. And when I talk about the present, I'm talking about the 20th century. So I'm not going to be talking about the global warming and all of those impacts. Rather, we're going to be looking at what happened in the Holocene over the course of before the 20th century. Very quickly, some of the basic results that we'll be looking at are based on coming from lake sediment cores. So you go into the field, typically in the early spring, so you can core from an ice surface. You collect a core from the bottom of the lake, and you can see that here. This is just sort of a schematic of that. You have a core. As you go deeper into the core, you go back through time. The sediment is always accumulating. At a series of levels, the black dots here, you extract a sample, You take it into the lab, you have to extract the pollen, and then you identify all the pollen grains. That's what those little yellow things are supposed to show. You can identify the taxon, the family, the genus, sometimes the species of it. And therefore, at all of these levels, we have an index of what the sample, what pollen was growing there. Why pollen? Because the pollen is an index of the vegetation around the lake. At a certain number of levels, we then date the cores. We get a chronology so that we can estimate the date of all of the samples. And this is extremely time intensive process. So the result of this is what I have a small schematic down at the bottom showing you a pollen diagram. And I'm not going to be looking at these in much detail today. Rather, we're going to be looking at the climate. But this data is important to see what it looks like. Here we have time, 0 at the top, and in this core, 7,000 years at the bottom. And here is the percentage of spruce, birch, and alder through time. So this is telling us, here 2,000 years ago, there was a lot more spruce pollen at this site, and so it was a lot colder. This is from the boreal forest. There's also charcoal, so we can look at the fire history and so on. So the result of this, each one of these cores is one diagram like this, a multivariate time series. So we have looking at the vegetation. Pollen is proportional to the vegetation, and because vegetation is associated with climate, we can estimate the climate. This topmost sample is what we call the surface sample. This is the pollen that's being deposited today, the modern samples, and we use this for calibration. So that's the second data set we have. And we collect these pollen diagrams from basically across the Arctic or across anywhere. And in that way, we can look at the space-time evolution of the vegetation. And we can then try to reconstruct the climates. I won't go into any detail of how this is done. This is sort of a standard methodology now. But if we look at this top diagram, we have this modern climate pattern and modern pollen pattern. So each of these dots is supposed to indicate one pollen diagram, such as I've just the schematic here. So at each dot, we know how the vegetation changed through time. At each here, we just have the modern pollen sample. For each of these sites, we then extract the modern climate using some sort of a gridded climate data set. And then we look at the association between the spatial patterns to develop a calibration equation, a kind of a regression type of equation. So this will then give us a formula which tells us if you have a certain pollen assemblage, what is going to be the climate. We then take a core, which is the time series that I just showed you. We apply this calibration equation to give us a time series of the climate at this site. There's other methodologies used to do it as well. Here again, here's the data matrix, which is the basis of the work. Here's this one particular lake. Here are these different calibrated radiocarbon ages. So we're always talking going back in time. This was 24 years ago, 38 years ago, and so on. These were the pollen percentages, and then these were transformed to July temperatures. So we do this at a spatial array of sites. And in that way, we can start to look at what was the spatial temporal evolution of the climate. Okay, then all of these go into databases. We have our own database at the LPC. This is, I think it's the largest paleoclimate and paleoenvironmental publicly available data set in Canada and probably in North America. And in addition, there are also these global databases, and all of our data, once it's been published, is sent to these databases. Neotoma for the pollen data, NOAA paleoclimates for the paleoclimate data, and Pangea being the European paleoclimate data set. So there's these data sets available. And in addition to our work, we then combine all of these data sets to show some of the results that we're getting. Okay, I mentioned these calibration data sets, and these are these modern data sets that we use to quantify past conditions. And over the course of this project that, like, as I said, it's been over 35 years that it's been going on. We've accumulated data. We've also worked with various other people to put together calibration data sets for northern Canada. So you can see here, I'm going to be talking mostly about this pollen data set, which is actually North American extent. But in addition, each of these dots is one of these lakes that we studied here. We've combined it with other people. We've put together a publicly available, downloadable, easily to use, Excel spreadsheets, calibration data sets of ostracods, diatoms, chironomids, and pollen. In addition, the modern limnology of all of the Arctic has been put together in these databases. And I was thinking about this when I was preparing this talk, and except for possibly Northern Europe, I don't think there's anywhere in the world that has such an extensive data set of calibration data sets that are publicly available in order to do paleoenvironmental research. So I'm not going to talk about all of the work that we did with the paleolimnological data, but just to say that these data sets are all available, and so anyone can go into them and use them to quantify past environments using their fossil record. So I'm going to start by looking at tree line history, and particularly in northwestern Quebec, where we had a long-term project working on that. Why tree line? Well, tree line is the southern boundary of the Arctic, and the tree line history will tell us if we know where the tree line is moving, because tree line is associated with the Arctic front. Now, the left-hand picture here, you can see a study we did a number of years ago. The mean position of the Arctic front is here, the orange line, and that is, of course, associated with tree line. Every individual year has been plotted here from 1958 to 2002, and it was color-coded going from red to blue. Older would be red and younger would be blue, or more recent would be blue. And we were hoping to see some sort of a trend, like all the blue would be to the north or something. We didn't see it. There's just a lot of variability. But one thing I would note is that there's evidence that the location of the Arctic front is associated with vegetation production. And that's shown on the right-hand side, where we have the red line is the mean position of the Arctic front. The blue line is the position in one particular year. And then the NDVI, greenness, or, production of the vegetation, is shown as anomalies from the long-term mean, green being positive, more production, brown being less productive. So if you look at 1958, the Arctic front was about the mean position that year. In 1989, the upper right-hand picture here, the Arctic front was located to the north of the mean position of the tree line. And you can see that there was a large positive anomaly of NDVI. So it was quite a productive year, as you would expect, because you had more tropical or mid-latitude air masses then. And the bottom two pictures, 1993 and 99, these were years when the Arctic front was located to the south of the mean position. And you can see that that's associated with a negative anomaly in the vegetation production. So this is evidence, I think, that you can use the position of the Arctic front, if you could reconstruct it, to determine past production or past vegetation movements. Well, tree line's been studied for a long time, and it's being studied, using vegetation and tree ring analysis. I'm only going to be talking about paleo studies here. And here's a textbook picture from Ruddiman's textbook, which shows the tree line story in central Canada, which, showing here time 0 to 6,000 years ago on the y-axis, and the x-axis showing position northward or southward of the present day. Here's the present day forest tundra, and according to this reconstruction, tree line was located well to the north of that from maybe 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. That was done a long time ago in the 1960s, much using peat deposits. In addition, there have been a few other studies done. In Labrador, there was a few studies done in the 1970s, but it's quite an incomplete picture. And then there have been two major studies, sort of long-term studies trying to understand, one in the Mackenzie Delta by Jim Ritchie and others in the 1970s and 1980s, which, presented, and we'll be looking briefly at that, what was going on with tree line in that region. And then I'm going to talk now about some work in northwestern Quebec, where we now have a nice sequence across the tree line, which has enabled us to look at tree line history in the region. And I should add, Pierre Richard also has done some work in the region in the 1970s. Okay, so here's what we're going to be looking at, and here's the tree line. Down to the south of it, we have the lichen woodland. To the north of it, we have the shrub tundra. And then the tree line is actually a very broad zone, the forest tundra. The forest tundra has the northern shrub subzone and the southern tree subzone. And you can see these pictures here on the right, which show what they look like. The lichen woodland, the entire landscape is covered by spruce trees, and after a fire, the spruce regenerates. In the forest tundra tree subzone, now the tops of the hills tend to be tundra, and you have trees growing now in the lower portion of the landscape. Again, after a fire, you would tend to have regeneration. In the shrub subzone, the northern subzone of the forest tundra, you have most of the landscape is now tundra. And the trees that you do find are typically in Krumholtz form, shrub form, and just in protected areas of the landscape. After a fire, they would tend not to regenerate. So you could get a deforestation over time as the remaining trees are burned, then the land regenerates to tundra. And finally, shrub tundra has entirely no trees. Okay, so we have a nice transect across this tree line. And I should add, I'm not talking about it today, but Pierre has done some work here to the north and to the south. So we have a pretty good record from the region. I won't talk about the vegetation history, but here's the climate history. So what we've done is we've reconstructed the climate from these pollen records, each one of these dots here, and then computed the average for the 4 zones. Start looking at the shrub tundra and the forest tundra shrub subzone. These are these 2 records down here. The blue is the shrub tundra. This is the forest tundra here. You can see that there's not much activity, basically a long-term cooling. Here's July temperature on the y-axis. This is the present here, 7,000 years ago on to the right. So we're going back in time to the right, not the usual way we do it, but so there's a long-term cooling in both of these zones. If we now look at the lichen woodland, this black line here, it was relatively cool right after deglaciation. Remember, there was some ice still in the region here. Then it gradually got warming. And then in the last couple thousand years, it's pretty much stabilized. In the forest tundra tree subzone, if the temperatures were identical in the middle Holocene from about 6,000 years ago to about 2,000 years ago. After that time, when the lichen woodland temperature remained the same, it got cooler in the tree subzone in the southern subzone of the forest tundra. This suggests then, and in fact, this is what the vegetation shows, is that in this earlier time, the vegetation throughout this region here was similar, and that this region has been deforested. The forest tundra tree subzone has been gradually deforested in the late Holocene, whereas this hasn't impacted the lichen woodland. Okay, so, and this matches entirely with sort of the vegetation history, a qualitative interpretation of the vegetation history. Okay, because we have a nice array of sites here, we can actually then plot the gradient of this frontal zone over time. Here we have July temperature on the y-axis, and here we're going from latitude 59, this northernmost site, to 55, the southernmost site, southernmost Grand Baleine, if you know that region. Okay, so now each one of these lines, then what we've done is we've simply plotted the temperatures and then plotted the temperature gradient. And we've done this for every 1,000-year interval. So look at this black line, the lowermost line here. What you can see is that at 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, well, the shrub tundra here is relatively cool. It's still relatively cool in the forest tundra, and it was a bit cooler than today, even in the lichen woodland. So you had this relatively shallow Arctic front, basically. Then, as the Holocene progressed, this Arctic front became steeper and restricted to this area between, say, 56 and 58 degrees. So this would be sort of the green line here, the brown line, and so on, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. The lichen woodland, or excuse me, in the shrub tundra, the temperature hasn't changed much over the course of the Holocene. In the lichen woodland, it's changed a little bit, but not that much. But because you have this area which was warmer in the forest tundra tree subzone in the mid-Holocene, this led to a steepening in the Arctic front. And then in the last 1,000 years, as we've had this cooling going on, neoglacial cooling, you've had a shallowing of the frontal gradient. So when you have a nice array of sites like this, you can actually reconstruct the history of the Arctic front in some detail. Unfortunately, this is the only region of North America where we have, an array of sites which enable us to do that. Okay, then in this area here in yellow, which is in the forest tundra shrub subzone, we have 6 pollen diagrams in a very small area, 10 by 20 kilometers, all measured at very high temporal resolution in order to enable to look at the fire history. So what happened here in this region here, now we're looking from 0 to 4,000 years ago, we had this neoglacial cooling here, and then there's been a long-term decrease in the temperature. Superimposed on this, you can see this variability, sort of this warm period here, which is, we can call it the Roman warm period, Dark Ages cold period, medieval warm period, Little Ice Age. So all of this climate variability that we recognize from the past couple thousand years is seen in this region as well. Okay, so now if we now look just across North America, we have, if we look at the Mackenzie Delta, here we have 3 pollen diagrams from sites that are now today in the tundra. So there shouldn't be any spruce, and this is the spruce pollen percentages. If it's more than 20%, that suggests spruce was growing in the region. So what happened here is that between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago, spruce was growing in the area of Sleet Lake in the Mackenzie Delta, where today it's not growing. Then between, say, 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, spruce was further north, which we saw earlier, in the central part, but spruce, the Arctic front had moved southward in the delta. And in northern Quebec, we see that tree line has never moved northward of its present day position, that is the tree limit. So it's not just movement of tree line, but also the association of what's going on within these zones that's important. And I'll just show you briefly. We can look at now there's this question of greening and browning of the Arctic. As you get warming, the Arctic greens and vice versa. We have up here, we have alder. And what this is showing, each dot here is one diagram from one of these regions. This first graph here is Alaska. This is the Mackenzie. This is the central region. This is northern Quebec, and this is Labrador. And what we're looking here is the difference from one millennium to the next in the alder percentages. So if it goes up, that means alder is expanding. And if it goes down, alder is decreasing. Shrubification, if you wish. And what we can see is that somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, sort of centered around 7,000 years ago, alder expanded across all of North America. Now, this had been known before from several regions, but I think we now realize that this is seen across all of North America. And so we're now in the process of looking at that to try to understand what's happening. So now let's move up to the Arctic. So this is a recent review article looking at the climate of the Arctic. And here we have, you can see the map at the upper left where the data is. And here we have from the ice cores, from the marine and from freshwater systems. Here's the ice core curves we just saw. And here we have from this marine and the freshwater systems, people's interpretation of when was the warmest period for this. And what you can see is that the warmest period was actually in the mid-Holocene, sort of before 6,000 or 4,000 years ago. It varies from site to site, but it's known that therefore it was much warmer in the Arctic. That was when the Milankovitch variability was, the incoming solar radiation was much greater, and therefore it was warmer. In addition, you had the ice sheet decaying, and so and that impact as well. Okay, so now we want to try to quantify that, go in the next step, a little bit more detail. So we're going to look at some pollen records. I'm going to be using the term the high Arctic for the polar desert, low Arctic is the tundra, and the middle Arctic is the transition between the two. So we're going to be looking at some pollen records. We also have done these studies from the boreal, but I won't be talking about that today. So here are the diagrams. So each one of these dots is one pollen diagram, and I should, and there you go. So these are the ones we looked at. The sites from Greenland, we got this from the various databases. I should say most of that work was done by one person named Fred Skill, and that was basically his life's work, was to do these pollen records, in addition to other things, of course. So that's about a third of the records. Another third of the records are from Baffin Island, and this was mostly done by a group of the Colorado people from INSTAR. And then there's the Western and Central Arctic, which we did in our lab. And here's the basic result. So here for these zones, Western Arctic, Central Arctic, Eastern Arctic, North Greenland, including Ellesmere, East Greenland, and South Greenland, here are the climate reconstructions, 0 to 10,000 years ago, 0 at the top, 10 at the bottom. And this is the mean July temperature for each of these zones. Notice the Western Arctic and the Central Arctic had the warmest conditions before 8,200 years ago. At 8,200 years ago, this is when the ice sheet collapsed, remember? There was a major transition in the climate. The Western and Central Arctic got to about average conditions. And then this is when you had the warmest conditions in the Eastern Arctic, North Greenland, and East Greenland. This lasted until about 5,200 years ago, when the Eastern Arctic to Eastern Greenland cooled, but it continued warming in South Greenland. And then about 3,800 years ago, you had further cooling in the Western Arctic and Central Arctic, and conditions sort of stabilized in South Greenland. And then 2,200 years ago, you got more cooling occurring in the Eastern Arctic to Eastern Greenland, Northern Greenland, and slight warming actually in the Central Arctic and Western Arctic, and stabilized conditions in South Greenland. So this is the first time we've actually been able to quantify the space-time evolution of the climate. And I noticed that just based on, what we had, this is only a 200-year resolution. And so the last sample, by the way, is simply post-Little Ice Age. So we have these key transitions that occurred. First is at 8.2. This is when the ice sheet sort of collapses, meltwater from the ice sheet slowed down. The second is at 5.2 kiloyears. And this is when the Milankovitch variation started to approach the modern day. And then the other major transitions, 3.8 and 2.2 kiloyears. At this point, you can start to see neoglacial cooling really coming in, and therefore the ice sheet of Greenland ice sheet, for example, expanding. Okay, so that's the climate history. So what's happened to the vegetation. Now, of course, that climate, the climate that I just showed you, this is based on the vegetation, but other records, including paleolimnological records that I don't have time to talk about, as well as these qualitative records, all seem to show a similar idea of this warming conditions in the early to mid Holocene. So what do we learn going back now to those pollen records about the history of the vegetation of the Arctic in response to these climate changes? Well, the first thing that happened is when a lake opened up and started to have water in it, so it was accumulating sediments, basically the plants arrived immediately. And here we have a series of graphs. This is the pollen percentages on the y-axis for a number of Arctic plants. And here we have time since local deglaciation. So what we did was we took all of the pollen records from across the Arctic, and then we just said, this is the base, whatever it is, 10,000 years ago or something, and this is going into the future, 5,000 years later. So we asked, when did the plants arrive? And the answer is immediately. So there was no migration lag. As soon as the landscape becomes open, plants arrive and can start to grow. And in fact, this is confirmed by genetic work that's being done, DNA analyses. A lot of work's being done in Greenland. And one thing that they've found, interestingly, is that many of these plants arrived in Greenland from Europe. That's where their origin is. They somehow made it across the Atlantic, opposite to the winds, and colonized Greenland from there. It gets more complicated across the Canadian Arctic, but nevertheless, when there's a warming, when the land becomes available, plants arrive immediately. The second major thing we can see from looking at the pollen records is that there have been very few changes in biodiversity over the course of the Holocene. These are messy diagrams, but they're really quite informative. So let's take a look at them. What we did was we took all of the pollen records from the Arctic, the ones I just showed you in the map. We just put them all into one big matrix where the variables are the pollen types, and the cases, or the other axis of the data matrix, are all of the samples. Every sample from every lake, in no matter what the time period is, and including all of the time periods. So we just put them all into one large principal components analysis. The way you interpret these biplots is the variables. We're looking at the correlation between the variables. If two variables are two arrows, these red arrows are next to each other, that means those variables are correlated, and they're anti-correlated to those at the opposite side of it. Each of the samples is 1 point here. And in this particular diagram on the left, they are colored by region. So what you can see is that the black and the red are off on the left. So that means that all of the samples from the Western and Central Arctic seem to resemble each other. Those from Greenland, the purple, the blues, are off on the right, and the Eastern Arctic is in between. So there's a gradient in biodiversity across the Arctic. Everyone knows that. This has been studied by botanists, but this is shown that this is retained in the vegetation record, in the pollen record. And furthermore, it's been retained through time. So on the right-hand side, we have exactly the same diagram. And again, if 2 points are close to each other, that means that those samples resemble each other. But now they're colored by age. So the black are older than 8.2, the red or in between, the blue are the youngest. And what you see when you look at these diagrams is basically nothing. That there hasn't been any major changes in the biodiversity over the course of the Holocene. And this makes sense. in spite of all the climate changes that have been occurring, well, the Arctic plants can basically live in the Arctic. And we know that as you go from the high Arctic to the mid-Arctic to the low Arctic, the high Arctic plants can still live in the mid-Arctic. They just, other taxa come in. But it seems that when you have large warming, it does not affect the biodiversity. Basically, you could have new taxa arriving very rapidly, as the dispersal of plots I just showed indicate, but there's no significant changes in the biodiversity. But the major impact of climate warming is on biological production. And we can look at this by looking at the pollen accumulation rates. And so here we have just standardized, because it's hard to compare between lakes. We're just looking now at the pollen production, and this is considered to be proportional to vegetation production on the landscape. What we can see is that in the Western and Central Arctic, the top diagram, here we're going from 0, the present on the left, to 10,000 years ago. There's some problematic dates here, but let's just look at the 10,000 years ago. In the Western and Central Arctic, it was more productive in the early Holocene. That's when it was reconstructed as warming. In the Eastern Arctic in North Greenland is typically more productive in the mid-Holocene. And in South Greenland, it's pretty much productive all the time, slightly more productive in the later Holocene. So this is suggesting then that when you have a global warming or climate warming or regional warming, it's in the Arctic, the biodiversity is not going to be affected much. Those plants can still basically live, but probably things like the boundary between the mid-Arctic and the high Arctic will move slightly northward. The Arctic will become more productive. New taxa may arrive very rapidly because dispersal does not seem to be a limiting factor, but the major impact is on biological production. Okay, I'm just going to very briefly take a look at how these climate changes impacted the human populations of the region. So in order to determine this, we need some estimate of past population density. Now, archaeologists have been looking at this all along. What we're trying to do, what we wanted, however, is to do a sort of go the next step and try to do a comparison of what happened to human populations in association with climate changes. And to do this, we're using a methodology that's called the Dates' data. And the method goes something like this. An archaeologist goes to a site, they analyze it the way archaeologists do, and they will date this particular site using radiocarbon. So they find a hearth of somebody had lived there. They find the arrowheads or whatever artifacts that they're analyzing. They interpret them the way they do. But all we're pulling from these is the date, because what that says is that at that location, at that point in time that the date tells us, there was a person there or a community there or something like that. Well, archaeologists do that, and all of these radiocarbon dates that they have been accumulating go into a database. It's called the CARD database, which was set up by Richard Moreland in the 1990s, and it's been maintained now by Andrew Martindale at UBC. The map that you can see in the lower left-hand side shows all of the radiocarbon dates that are in the database, which say that somebody was located in that location at some point in time. Now, those dates, some of them, this particular date could be 8,000 years ago, could be 2,000 years ago. This is just all the dates. But the logic behind this methodology goes, if there were more people in some region at some point in time, they would leave more traces on the landscape. And that means that archaeologists going through the landscape, there would be a higher probability of finding these sites and therefore dating the sites. And therefore, we can use the number of radiocarbon dates through time as an index of population density. Okay, so the bottom right-hand side shows you the sort of the steps. Of course, we have to do a lot of corrections. The histogram here shows for the Arctic the number of dates. Here we go, 15,000 years ago to 0 at the right. And this is simply the number of dates is the histograms through time. Very few in the distant past, and they've been increasing over time. Well, we then convert this to a so-called sum probability density, which gives us a continual time series and also accounts for the errors of the radiocarbon date. So that's the next step. We then apply a taphonomic correction, which in the Arctic is probably unnecessary, but it's sort of a standard procedure. That is, because over time, older dates have a higher probability of being destroyed through normal geomorphic processes, we have to correct for that. And there's sort of a standard way of doing that. And finally, because of the calibration of radiocarbon, we have to smooth the curve. So that's the final curve that we'll be analyzing. And we also have to account for something, sampling intensity and things like that. And there's sort of a methodology to do that. So now we wanted to look at this for the Arctic, and here we are. So here are the dates. Here are two maps showing exactly the same thing. On the bottom are the 4 regions that I'll be looking at in the next graph. And then it's also analyzed in subregions that I won't be talking about. Okay, so at the top are just all the paleoclimate curves. And the idea here is we're trying to say, let's compare the paleoclimate to these curves to see if we can get some indication of what might have caused population to change through time. The bottom curve is the one I just showed you, the overall population curve. The green is the uncorrected, the gray is the corrected. We don't think that the taphonomic correction should be applied in the Arctic. So we're going to be mostly interpreting this green curve. So you can see that it's very low. It was increasing starting maybe about after 7,000 years ago. Then it reached a peak about 3,900 years ago. And then there was a decrease across the entire region in the population. And then there was this secondary increase afterwards. We cut these off at about CE 1700 because, of course, there was this major depopulation due to the colonization and the diseases that went with it and the disruption of the lifestyles and so on. But also in the more recent past, archaeologists probably don't use radiocarbon dates because they have historical artifacts that are used to date. If we now compare it to this temperature curve, which is based on those pollen records I just showed you, you can see that this gradual increase, this large scale increase, that's just normal human population increase. You expect over time populations to increase. This decrease, however, does seem to be associated with a long-term cooling, the neoglacial cooling. If we now go look at the different regions here, first is the Beringia. So that would be the area that was unglaciated during the glaciation. There's the subarctic, the Arctic, and Greenland. So if we look now across these regions, we see a similar picture. Here in Beringia, on the lower right-hand graph, you had this long period when people were living there. And then starting around 7,000 years ago, this is, slightly after the final collapse of the ice sheet, there was this increase in population. Then there was this decrease in population here, starting 3,900 years ago, and then the second increase. Now, notice this large increase here, starting at 7,000 years ago, is when it really picked up. This is after you've had the maximum warmth in the region and when the temperatures basically stabilized to Holocene levels. There doesn't really seem to be any major climate change associated with this decrease here. If we now look at the subarctic, this entire boreal forest region up here, again, there was this, increase starting about 8,000 years ago. Of course, there's more land available, so the population is going to increase. A large increase, and then it's slightly decreased again 3,900 years ago. Again, here, now we're starting to see perhaps an association with the climate. This large population increase happened during a warming climate. And then sort of the temperature decreased, stabilized, and then further decreased. And what happens is, you have this temperature decrease, the population decreases, but eventually the population can simply adapt it to the new environment and begins this late Holocene increase. Over here, we have the Arctic on the lower left-hand side, and then the Greenland results on the upper right-hand side. And again, what's interesting here is you had this warm early Holocene, and then when you got the cooling, that's when the population started to move into the Arctic. This is the sea ice curve. This is the temperature curve. And again, up here for Greenland, the Greenland sea ice curve and the temperature curve. And you see a similar thing. When you start to get sea ice increasing, people moved into the area, even though the temperature is cooling. That seems to be sort of secondary. There is some association of cooling with a population decrease at smaller time scales. So these can really be analyzed at several different scales. Well, I'm running out of time, and I can just say that for us, we don't really look in detail at the archaeological results. We're presenting these population curves and suggesting potential impacts on what human populations, but of course, to understand that, you have to go into the archaeological and historical record. Okay, very briefly, so we've quantified the climate history of North America, and one key point here is that you can't use the Greenland and Canadian ice cores to represent the climate across the entire region. Tree line history is quite complex, but you can explain it in terms of the Arctic front of variability. So we had this earlier thermal maximum in the west and the east in the Arctic, and I didn't show it, but also in the boreal. The forcing is a combination of paleogeographic and orbital changes. And sort of a key message here is that the impact of climate variability on the vegetation is greater on production than on biodiversity. Vegetation responds very rapidly to warming. We've also looked at the freshwater, but I haven't talked about that. And we've seen this suggestions of an impact of climate variability on paleodemography, but this needs to be regionally interpreted. And I'm just, we're continuing to work on this. I just want to very quickly thank everyone, the many students who have worked on this project over the years, and funding, of course, PCSP, who've always been helpful and given us everything we needed. This was basically funded by the Discovery Grant, which was usually used up entirely for the field season and for running the lab. And so for really getting this project across, these collaborative grants were really quite key. And in particular, I have to say a grant from CIFCAS. You may remember that project. We tried several times and finally got an individual grant from that. Very small amount of money for a couple of years, but that enabled us to hire several of these students and postdocs who really moved the project along and enabled it to be finished. Okay, and here's just a list of the references, some of the key references from this work, including some I haven't talked about. Okay, well, that was a bit long, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Konrad. This is Leonard Barry. I'll moderate the question period here. That was a very interesting talk, showing tremendous depth of data and complexity of data that you have to deal with. We have 4 or 5 questions here, which I will proceed through sequentially, and then I can ask at the end if anyone has anything to add before we close. So the first question was from Peter McKinnon, and he points out that he was involved in extracting 2 of the polar shelf Agassiz ice cores. Can you share your view on the potential for agricultural development in the Arctic with respect to soil and moisture over the next century due to climate change?
Yeah, the Arctic doesn't really have, well, it depends on where you are. If you're in the tundra, you've got some soil development, but in the Arctic, first of all, the soils of the Arctic, they're all what, gelisols by definition. But if you were to look at the older classification, they're considered, you know, inceptisols, or so there's really no soil in the Arctic. There's just, if you think of the high Arctic, if you remember that picture that I showed, there's almost no organic matter accumulation. When you get into the mid-Arctic, there's a little bit. So you know, quite apart from, it's probably still going to be too cold to enable agriculture. I just don't see it as being at all viable.
So the second question was from Bill Pugsley. He had a question about the state of the art in deducing precipitation trends from proxy data, in addition to the temperature estimates. Particularly, he recalls working with Dennis Delorme when he did research at CCIW on ostracods found in lake sediment in Saskatchewan. We attempted to look at drought frequency in the prairies up to 600 years ago. So state of the art in deducing precipitation trends.
Yes, this is quite possible. Using pollen, we can also get the precipitation. I didn't show that. But so we have comparable curves for the precipitation. You can also look at it from the point of view, as you've mentioned, using ostracods, using chironomids, using diatoms. You can also look at lake level variability. So in the Arctic, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of that, but certainly down in the boreal zone, we've done a lot of that work in the Yukon, and people have done it across the area. It's easiest in areas like Saskatchewan in the central North America, where you have very large variations in lake level. But yeah, there's been a lot of work on that, and I just didn't have time to talk about it.
Good. The third question is from David Fisher. Why are the Canadian and Greenland ice cores showing bigger temperature changes than the biological records?
I was unaware that they were.
Yeah, David, are you able to explain? I guess David has left us, so we'll leave that and go to the next one then. John Reed asks, does traditional knowledge give any support to population trends that you discussed?
We don't do really a lot of interpretation of these. I think we're putting these out, and we're asking for people who are interested in these questions to go actually analyze them. I think what this work does is, for example, the archaeologists have identified this decrease in population of 3.9 thousand years ago in a couple of different regions. And what we've shown is that it occurs everywhere. We also show the association with climate. But I think how to interpret these things, that's just not my field. And so I don't go there. And I think it's what we want to do is we want to put these results out there. Of course, it's all open, and people can look at it and tell us, well, what happened in this region? How did the people adapt? What does it mean? And this is where the traditional knowledge certainly would come in. If the population has gone down when the ice was more extensive, why would that have occurred? I don't know. And I think that this is what we want people to do with these results.
And there was an associated question by Sawada Michael. The population decline seems to correspond with more of a comment to just after the 4.1K event. If that is still is that still a thing? Right, that you just mentioned that I think that there was a decrease, right?
Yeah, there is. And in addition to sort of an event, it does seem that this sets in motion the long-term cooling. And there's still some question about how extensive is that event. We're sort of looking at the longer term changes. And so I think what happened was the 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 4.2 event, whether it was sort of the kicked in a long-term cooling or whether it's part of that whole, how that's part of a whole process, I don't think people are, it's quite clear yet.
Yeah. John Stone asks, what data set gives the best temporal resolution?
Money. Basically, what the limiting factor is, well, there's two things. First is sedimentation rate. And in the Arctic, it's relatively low. But is that study that I did, that sort of the high resolution study in Northern Quebec shows is when you have the time and the money to hire somebody to count at very high resolution, you can get the results out. And basically that's what it came down to.
Mm. Mm. So you're not limited by sediment volume in any way?
Not for these microfossils. Maybe for ostracods, they might be one, sort of for chironomids, but for pollen, you know, you need a CC. That it's not that. It's what is the sediment accumulation rate? And typically in like across the Arctic, you know, you don't have very good one, but then you'll find one site that has, for some reason, accumulated a lot of sediment. And so then if you have the time to analyze it at high resolution, you can get a high resolution paleoclimate record. I don't think there's this old idea of, you know, like it takes a long time and migration lag and all of that. That's all been abandoned. As I've shown and as other people have shown, the pollen can respond extremely rapidly. We're doing work, as Dawn mentioned, in the Gatineau region, and we can resolve environmental changes on the order of years to decades.
Yeah. So the next question, Tony Lukovic asks, although you did not talk about the present, how much warmer was the early to mid Holocene than present day summers? And does that difference vary across the Arctic?
Yes, it does vary across the Arctic. It's not entirely clear. We're sort of working on that at the moment, is try to key them together. The problem with tying together the instrumental record with paleo records is that because they're sort of regression based, the variability tends to be in the past tends to be lower than it is in the present. But from everything I've seen is that early Holocene warming was as warm as certainly the late 20th century. But it wasn't everywhere, which is the big difference with the present. So you could have been as warm as today, but only in one part of the Arctic, which is a combination of sort of the synoptic response to the presence of the ice sheet, presence of, you know, meltwater and all of that, and also the incoming solar radiation, which was a bit larger in the early Holocene.
So we have a dynamic meteorology question here for you, Konrad, which can you speculate on the effect of the shifting Atlantic meridional circulation, ocean circulation, contributing to the cooling east while the west warmed?
Yeah, I don't really want to speculate on that. The one thing that I would notice is that the late Holocene warm conditions in South Greenland are also seen in Labrador and Northern Quebec. So it does seem that something going on in Baffin Bay, which is sort of the source region of the AMOC, would have kept that region, I think, warmer than happened in sort of North Greenland and the Eastern Arctic. So something is going on with that, but I'm not entirely, we're sort of working on that. I don't have a good story at this time.
Mm, mm. Nothing connected to the early breakup of the ice sheet and the drainage out the Gulf of St. Lawrence into the Atlantic.
Yes, it might be there, but for me, it's more that the early warm period in the Western Arctic has to do with, first of all, the Milankovitch higher insulation, and also by the presence of an ice sheet with the high pressure system. So the clockwise flow brings southerly flow to the to the Western Arctic and Central Arctic, making it warmer.
Yes.
What exactly that what exactly the AMOC is doing, I'm not entirely sure on that.
Yeah, that's a complex question. David Fisher just came back to clarify. For instance, the Agassiz Holocene ice core proxy temperature suggests a 5-degree warmer early Holocene, and I guess his question was that you weren't seeing 5 degrees, were you?
No, it's just several degrees. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's, of course, the Agassiz, what, 1,000 meters up in the air? I mean.
Yeah, on way up in northern Ellesmere.
Yeah, so it's also a very high altitude, and so I don't know.
Yeah, 2 or 3 kilometers.
Yeah.
That's the end of our questions. I did have a quick comment that on your remark regarding the the origin of the pollen being in the Arctic, at least from being European, a bit surprising. My expertise is in long-range transport patterns and Arctic air pollution, and it's very clear that most of the airflow, on average, at least in the winter, and spring, and is occurring over the pole, and so interesting that you're seeing in the pollen record mostly exotic European pollens. Is that correct?
Well, it's when I was talking about that, I was talking about the plants themselves, not the pollen.
Yeah.
So the plants are being, some propagule, the seeds or something, was somehow transported from Europe to Greenland, perhaps being blown on the ice, perhaps being brought by birds, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The pollen transport itself, that's a different question. You're right.
Yeah.
But here we're talking about where the plants originated. So, and it's not all species, it's only some of them that have been studied in that way.
Okay. Well, I think we've had a good, healthy question period here, and it's time for me to turn it back over to Barry Goodison to wrap it up. And thank you, Konrad.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Konrad. This has been an incredibly interesting talk and a different time frame than a lot of us work with. And it's really good to learn about what the university and the work that's going on there. And speaking of University of Ottawa, our next meeting will be on, our next virtual talk will be on the 18th of February, when in fact we have we call it a student trio, students of Luke Copeland, Abby Dalton on glacier changes on Southeast Ellesmere, and that'll connect to Andrew Hamilton's work talking about glacier-ocean interactions, and then to Adam Garbo talking about his work on validating and improving iceberg drift models in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. So we keep moving in that high Arctic context, and we hope that people will be able to join us on 18th of February, and notices will go out like that. So again, thank you very much, Konrad, for today. Really enjoyed it. And thank you everybody who's still on the call, realizing that you're heading off, some of you may be heading off to lunch. So thank you very much and have a good day.